Gotham never truly sleeps. It only dreams in the dark. Tonight, I want you to walk its streets with me, not the Gotham of movies or headlines, but the one that lives between heartbeats, the city where a boy's vow became a legend, and a legend became a mirror for all of us. This isn't an action story. It's a quiet one, a story about what happens after the fight, when the mask comes off, and all that's left is a man who refuses to give up on his city or himself. So, before we start, take a breath, let the sound of nature settle, feel that calm that comes right before the storm. And as you listen, tell me in the comments, who do you think Gotham really is? Is it the villain that made him, or the home that saved him? I read every thought, every theory, every dream. If the sound of Gotham's rain helps you drift off tonight, or the story makes you feel something real, give this video a little tap on the like button. It's our quiet signal, like lighting the bat signal in the sky, letting me know you're still awake out there, somewhere in the dark. Now close your eyes, and let's begin The Shadow and the City. A journey through Batman's legend, told not in noise and chaos, but in whispers, memory, and rain. The night it happens is not extraordinary to anyone but the boy. A quiet sidewalk, a movie marquee spilling light into damp air, the city murmuring its usual threats. Then the gun, the demand, the fear that rises too quickly to catch, and the way the world seems to fall into a narrow tunnel of sound. Bruce is 8. He watches Thomas and Martha Wayne collapse to the pavement, and something in him that should have broken, instead, sharpens to a single point. That point is a promise wordless at first, then articulated in the years that follow, until it becomes the axis around which his entire life will turn. He will not allow what happened to him to happen to others. He will find a way to make the city answer for what it has become. Time stretches and grows rigorous. The child becomes a young man who understands that resolve without preparation is just another vulnerable feeling. He disappears from Gotham for years long enough that the city forgets his gait and his face-seeking instructors who can break him down and reassemble him with purpose. He learns to map a room with his hearing, to count heartbeats, to read the small betrayals people carry in their posture. He studies criminology and forensics until patterns emerge where chaos once reigned. He trains in disciplines that teach him pain is a message, not a command. He becomes a detective in the oldest sense of the word, a finder-out, someone who moves through uncertainty with the composure of someone who has trained for it. Coming home is stranger than leaving. Gotham has a way of misting the edges of memory. There are corners you think you know until you round them and discover the city has grown a new layer of grime and neon. The great houses on the hills seem higher and emptier, the alleys somehow narrower. The police precinct smells like burnt coffee and a permanent argument. You can tell a city's health by the length of its shadows. Gotham's have been lengthening for a long time. Organized crime and municipal corruption have formed a handshake, and the most vulnerable citizens pay for the bargain every night. In another life, Bruce might have fought that fight in a court or a boardroom, but a boy's vow rarely chooses polite arenas. The decision is not simply to fight, but to become a force that tilts the city's physics. Bruce studies the psychology of intimidation and learns a simple truth. Criminals do not fear force as much as they fear the unknown. Fear, properly used, is a non-lethal weapon. It arrests movement before it starts, remakes a predator into prey for a heartbeat, and a heartbeat is enough to change outcomes. When the bat comes through the study window one night, it is not an omen so much as an answer to a question he has been asking since the sidewalk ran red. What symbol could make the wicked see themselves as the hunted? The bat is not elegant or noble. It is a shape that swallows light. It is the outline of a nightmare. Symbols require infrastructure. Behind a cowl there must be a mind that has anticipated failure 12 moves in advance, and a body that still advances on the 13th. Beneath Wayne Manor, stone gives way to a cavern that had always been there, waiting for a purpose. It becomes a workshop and a library, an evidence locker and a chapel. Tools collect, a suit that is more armor than costume, a belt that is less a gadget rack than a traveling thesis on problem solving, a vehicle designed to rewrite a chase into geometry. Alfred, the steward, who became a guardian, tends not to the myth but to the man binding wounds, brewing coffee, and asking the quiet questions that keep Bruce tethered to the person who once held his mother's hand on a calm walk to a theater. In this long preparation, he sets boundaries that seem unremarkable until they are tested. He will not kill. He will not use a gun. Both decisions are less about moral superiority than about identity maintenance. The night in the alley was a guns night. He refuses to let that tool author any part of his story. The rule against killing is harder because the city will hand him a dozen excuses a week to break it. But crossing that line would collapse the distinction that justifies his existence. The vow is not revenge, it is prevention. He is not there to end anyone so much as to end repetition. The city he comes home to does not exist in a vacuum. Gotham's anxieties echo real ones that have rolled through American streets. The despair of the Great Depression years when he first appeared on newsstands. The corrosion of trust that followed mid-century revelations of organized crime entwined with power. The late 20th century eras when urban decay and fear felt ambient, like humidity. In those years, headlines and subways and street corners carried the same argument, whether order would come from institutions that had broken faith or from people willing to step beyond them at personal risk. Gotham sets that question to a noir key and asks it every night. Once the work begins, it does not roar, it accumulates. Reports of a shape on rooftops. A rumor traded between patrol officers that a man in black dragged 3 corrupt vice cops into the light. A mobster whispering about a warehouse where the lights went out and the night hissed. A lieutenant named Gordon who hears the story and does not laugh because he has spent enough years fighting both crime and colleagues to recognize a new variable when it enters an equation. The city is a skeptic by habit, but even skeptics make room for patterns. The bat signal will come later. For now, belief spreads in smaller ways. A criminal who looks up before prying open a car door. A mother who takes a different route home because she feels, for the first time in years, that someone is watching out for her. Origin stories often reflect one another across universes, and the mirroring clarifies the particular shape of this one. A blind boy in Hell's Kitchen grows into a man who channels law by day and something harder to codify by night. He and Bruce share an urban syllabus of grief and grit. But where one leans on radar and Catholic conscience, the other leans on fear and forensic discipline. A different billionaire in a brighter universe builds himself into a suit of armor and calls his courage innovation. He and Bruce share the ability to turn wealth into leverage, but the bat chooses anonymity and ritual, where iron chooses charisma and spectacle. These parallels are not detours, They help frame the choice that defines Bruce Wayne, not merely to become powerful, but to become an anonymous boundary the city learns not to cross. Memory is not static in a city like this. Bruce returns to Crime Alley more than once, not to indulge pain, but to calibrate it. He understands that grief either owns you or you own it as craft. On those nights, he does not rehearse the gunshot. He rehearses the vow. The vow has matured. It has learned logistics, developed patrol routes, informed investments at Wayne Enterprises that quietly funnel to civic programs and technologies that help the police solve cases without depending on the temper of a vigilante. His private war, if it is to mean anything, must reduce the need for itself. And still, the alley is always there. It reminds him that the mission began with a family and a weapon and a city that did not stop any of it in time. The bat is a mask, but it is also a metronome that keeps the measure of his nights. He has decided, in a way that feels less like a decision than a recognition, that Gotham is not to be saved once, but to be held, again and again, at the edge where it likes to live. People sometimes ask whether he is driven by anger. Anger lit the first match. Discipline kept the fire useful. What remains, after the training and the tools and the careful rituals of fear, is a particular kind of hope that a single life, constrained by hard rules and sharpened by study, can bend a city's probabilities toward mercy. The first time he steps fully into the suit, he understands how thin the line is between theater and theology. The cape moves like a shadow that has learned choreography. The cowl robs him of peripheral vision and gifts him anonymity. The emblem sits over his sternum like a thesis statement you can see from a rooftop away. He is not invulnerable. He will be cut and concussed and outnumbered for most of his career, but he will be consistent, and consistency is its own kind of myth. The predators of Gotham, superstitious or not, will add a new variable to their plans, the possibility that the dark is not empty. When people recall the beginning later after partners arrive, after rogues acquire names and motifs, after searchlights carve the bat into cloud, they will picture the alley, the promise, the window shattered by a winged answer. They will not see the years between as clearly, the notebooks, the calloused knuckles, the study of how a city breathes when it thinks no one is listening. But those years are the true origin, because they transform a wound into a craft. A boy swore an oath, and a man learned how to keep it. The rest of the story will expand and complicate and test that oath. For now, it is enough to understand the shape of its beginning. A life redirected at nightfall, a city that starts to check the rooftops, and a symbol that teaches fear to work for the innocent instead of against them. Training was never a single journey. It was a series of recalibrations, each one peeling away a layer of the boy who once stood helpless in an alley. Bruce did not leave Gotham seeking vengeance so much as comprehension. He understood early that justice could not depend on emotion. It had to be built like architecture, with discipline as mortar. So he went where knowledge lived in its most extreme forms, in mountain monasteries and Bacali gyms, in universities and war zones. He learned to treat his body and mind as instruments, tuning them until each responded to command without hesitation. The art of control, he found, was not in violence itself, but in precision, to hit only what needed striking, to stop when it was enough. From one teacher, he learned silence so deep he could move through a crowded room unnoticed. From another, he learned that deception was a language spoken most fluently by those who understood truth. A detective in France taught him how to follow a thought as others followed footprints. A chemist in Japan taught him that every toxin had an antidote if one looked from the right angle. There were mentors who broke him to rebuild him, fighters who took him apart, philosophers who showed him how to rebuild purpose from pain. He didn't just gather skills, he collected philosophies, each one shaping his evolving code. Years abroad stretched into a kind of exile. Bruce understood that knowledge without a moral axis was as dangerous as the crime he meant to fight. So his studies bent toward restraint. He learned that fear was a resource, not an emotion to flee. A samurai once told him, "If you master fear, you master every opponent who depends on it." The phrase stayed with him, surfacing later when the image of the bat took root in his mind. Returning to Gotham was like walking into a dream, half forgotten and half rotten. The skyline had grown heavier, weighted with both steel and sin. The corruption that had once killed his parents now wore uniforms and suits. It had become polite, procedural, systemic. Bruce Wayne, the billionaire, was welcomed home as a curiosity, the prodigal heir come back to invest. But Bruce, the apprentice of 100 disciplines, saw the city differently. He studied it the way he had studied criminals abroad, as an organism built from need, habit, and fear. Wayne Manor was no longer just a home. It became a headquarters of reconstruction. Beneath its foundation, he found caverns that had long been silent, a hollowed space that felt as if it had been waiting for him. The cave wasn't merely a hideout, it was a metaphor made tangible, the subconscious of Gotham itself, dark and full of echoing possibilities. Down there, plans took form. The suit was designed not as costume but armor, an evolution of the principles he had learned in those far places. Lightweight, adaptable, built to protect rather than to conquer. The mask, however, was philosophy. It was anonymity turned into justice. To be Batman meant understanding fear as a system of energy exchange. Criminals relied on it to paralyze victims. He would repurpose it to paralyze them. Every detail, the pointed ears, the black silhouette, the sudden movement from shadow to light, was crafted to make fear flow in the opposite direction. He became, by design, an inversion of the predator-prey relationship that ruled Gotham's nights. It wasn't a perfect beginning. His first missions were marked by miscalculations, broken bones, police chases, near exposure. He had trained his body to endure and his mind to analyze, but Gotham was a variable he had underestimated. A city has instincts of its own, and Gotham's instinct was survival through corruption. He adjusted, refining his tactics, shifting from brute intervention to surgical disruption. He learned when to let rumor do half the work, how to turn a single act of terror against the criminal element into a week of whispered stories that traveled faster than the truth. Each night became a test of equilibrium. How far could he push without becoming what he fought? Each morning, Alfred stitched wounds, both visible and unseen, offering the calm judgment of a man who understood war but preferred peace. "You are making yourself a myth," Alfred told him once, "and mimps don't heal easily." Bruce said nothing. Healing wasn't the goal, prevention was. Mimps, after all, endured longer than men. As his crusade solidified, Gotham began to shift around him in subtle ways. Criminal networks grew paranoid. Police precincts split between those who hunted him and those who quietly rooted for him. News outlets debated whether the Batman was hero or hallucination. The city had found a new rhythm, a darker one, but not entirely hopeless. His training had not only built a fighter, but a strategist. He knew fear could not police a city alone. Fear could only make space for change. So Bruce began to use Wayne Enterprises as his daylight weapon. Advanced technology, forensic research, and urban renewal projects, funded under the guise of philanthropy, formed the infrastructure of his campaign. At night, those same technologies became gadgets, vehicles, and weapons of persuasion. The bat symbol itself became shorthand for possibility. It wasn't meant to dominate the skyline, but to haunt it as suggestion that order could still stand up to decay. Criminals began to tell stories about eyes in the dark, about a presence that could not be bribed or predicted. The stories contradicted one another, which only made them stronger. Bruce had turned training into transformation, discipline into doctrine. He had learned in foreign lands that mastery was not the absence of fear, but the command of it. Now, in the heart of his broken city, that lesson had become architecture. The cave, the suit, the mission, all constructed from the same principle that darkness could be repurposed. The boy in the alley had once looked up at a night that offered no protection. The man beneath the cowl looked up at the same sky and decided it would never be empty again. The first year was never meant to be legend, was survival. Gotham, for all its shadows and superstitions, was not waiting to be saved. It was a city to use to disappointment, to fluent in corruption, to believe in miracles. Bruce entered that landscape not as a savior, but as a variable, an interruption in the machinery of decay. The first time he tried to intervene, he failed. The disguise was crude, the timing poor. He was caught between police floodlights and criminals who saw through the ruse. A bullet grazed his side, another shattered glass near his face. He escaped, barely, bleeding across rooftops that didn't yet recognize his weight. Failure taught him more than training ever had. It stripped away the last of his abstractions and forced him to adapt to Gotham's rhythm. This was not a battlefield or monastery. It was an ecosystem of desperation, where power was traded in fear, and fear was a currency he intended to master. He returned to the cave, patched himself up, and reviewed every second of the night. He noticed the moment panic blurred his movement, the sound of hesitation between one decision and the next. He promised himself he would never pause again. Fear could not be conquered, but it could be rerouted. When he stepped out again, the bat was ready. The suit had been refined, lighter and stronger. The symbol on his chest bolder, a declaration and a warning in one. He had studied the city's patterns, when the gangs met, when the police shifted patrols, where the sirens took too long to arrive. Gotham, he realized, had a pulse. And like any living thing, it could be manipulated by pressure at the right points. His first true victory came quietly. A drug shipment intercepted at the docks. The crew left, tied and terrified, whispering about a creature that moved faster than their fear. There were no witnesses, but plenty of rumors, and rumors were what he needed most. Gotham's underworld thrived on control, through intimidation. He would reclaim that language and speak it better. Each confrontation became a test in psychology, how to appear more than human without losing the humanity beneath the mask. In another part of the city, a different kind of war was being waged. Lieutenant James Gordon had transferred from Chicago, seeking a quieter life, only to find Gotham's rot deeper than any he had known. He was surrounded by officers who accepted bribes like clockwork and superiors who preferred silence to integrity. Yet Gordon remained steady, stubborn in his ethics, a rare constant in a city addicted to compromise. The two men were fighting the same enemy from opposite ends of the moral spectrum, unaware of how their paths would converge. The turning point came one humid night when a car bomb intended for Gordon's family detonated prematurely. Bruce heard the call over the police scanner and was there before backup arrived. He moved through smoke and debris, disarmed the second device, and vanished before Gordon could get a clear look. All the lieutenant saw was a figure, impossible, dark, deliberate, moving with the confidence of something both human and myth. That moment planted a question in Gordon's mind that would never leave. What if Gotham wasn't completely lost? Over the following months, the rhythm of the city began to change. Gordon started to see the patterned tooth raids that hit the right targets. The crime rings collapsing without bloodshed. The criminals left for police like unwanted gifts. Batman was methodical, building a map of Gotham's criminal networks and dismantling them piece by piece. He took notes, left marks, tested boundaries. In back alleys and warehouses, he studied not just the guilty, but the machinery of guilt. Who paid whom? Who looked the other way? Who profited from despair? Each night added data to the investigation that had begun in that alley decades ago. But Gotham resists simplicity. Every step forward pressed back with twice the force. Corrupt officials tightened their grip, and the mob grew bolder, convinced that if they drew Batman into the open, they could unmask and destroy him. They failed to realize that exposure was part of his plan. Fear needed evidence to take hold. So he let himself be seen, once or twice, at the edge of light, just enough to make witnesses uncertain whether they'd glimpsed a man or a myth. Meanwhile, Bruce's daylight life played its own role. Wayne Enterprises' public philanthropy began restoring parts of the city long neglected, funding orphanages, clinics, and housing. The irony was not lost on him. By day, he healed what by night he defended. The media began to talk about Gotham's dual Renaissance economic revival, paired with a sudden, inexplicable drop in violent crime. Neither side of the city knew how connected the two were. Still, the balance was fragile. One mistake could unravel it. When a rookie cop nearly shot him during a rooftop chase, Batman realized that his war on crime could easily turn into a war with the very people he meant to help. He needed a bridge away to legitimize his presence without losing anonymity. That bridge became Gordon. Their first conversation was wordless, a spotlight beam into the fog and a silhouette stepping out of it. Trust, when it came, arrived in fragments, shared information, coordinated raids, a mutual understanding that Gotham's salvation required both light and shadow. Outside the city's boundaries, other stories were unfolding, stories of people who would one day share his burden or challenge his methods. But in this first year, Batman was still singular, still defining his role. The criminals called him a demon. The police called him a vigilante. The people whispered his name like a rumor they hoped was true. Gotham had not yet learned to love him, but it had begun to depend on the idea of him. As the months passed, Bruce began to understand that the mask was not just armor, it was a mirror. It reflected the city's own contradictions, justice wrapped in fear, courage fed by trauma, hope that wore darkness like a disguise. Gotham was not healed, not even close, but it had changed its posture. Predators looked up more often. Citizens walked with a little less hesitation. The experiment had worked. Fear had found a new direction. When winter came and the city lights flickered through falling snow, Bruce stood on the highest tower in Gotham and watched the streets below. The city pulsed, imperfect and alive, stubborn in its survival. Somewhere down there, Gordon was filing another report about an unidentified assailant who seemed to be cleaning up the streets. Bruce allowed himself a quiet smile. The year had taught him that victory was not a headline, it was endurance. Gotham did not need a savior. It needed a reminder that the night could still belong to the just. Gotham does not accumulates. Each decade lays another layer of soot and memory across its skin until even its air feels older than the people who breathe it. In that atmosphere, the city becomes less a place and more an inheritance, one passed down through crime, loyalty, and guilt. It has its own pulse, steady, erratic, and unrelenting, and Batman learned to hear it the way others might hear their own heartbeat. By now, the rhythm was familiar, the slow grind of corruption, the quick staccato of panic when a rumor of him moved through the streets. Yet within that pulse lived something stranger in intimacy. Gotham, for all its hostility, was beginning to speak to him. He saw it in the architecture first. The city's skyscrapers rose like ambition. Its alleys sank like regret. Every building seemed to carry two stories, one for the daylight that paid the rent, another for the night that paid the price. Wayne Tower stood high above it all, gleaming and defiant. But Bruce knew it was an island in a sea of decay. He used to think the city was sick because of its people. Now he understood the sickness was structural. Gotham was built by men who had confused permanence with morality, who believed stone and steel could outlast sin. It was a city designed to look strong while it rotted underneath. Gotham's geography shaped its morality. Neighborhoods were divided by more than money. They were divided by belief. Uptown, people believed the system would eventually fix itself. Downtown, people believed the system was the problem. In the middle sat a police force, pretending not to drown. Commissioner Loeb had mastered that art long before Gordon arrived, keeping one hand on the badge and the other on the payroll of every major crime family. The rank and file followed suit. Batman had once thought his enemies wore masks. Now he saw that corruption's favorite disguise was a uniform. His war against crime had made progress, but only against symptoms. Each time he broke a smuggling ring or dismantled a syndicate, another one formed like scar tissue. It wasn't until he began tracing money that he saw the true shape of Gotham's ecosystem. Politicians funded by mob dollars, police budgets built on bribes, charities that laundered blood money. Gotham didn't just tolerate corruption, it depended on it. The city's underworld was the invisible skeleton holding it upright. That knowledge changed his mission. He had once been content to frighten criminals into retreat. Now he wanted to understand the city's metabolism, to find its organs of power and apply pressure until they collapsed. It was the detective side of him, methodical, obsessive, that began to eclipse the soldier. Night after night, he studied case files stolen from the GCPD, cross-referenced names with financial records, traced ownership through shell corporations that looped endlessly back to the same handful of men. He realized the city didn't need a savior. It needed an auditor. And yet, amid all that analysis, he couldn't forget the human texture of Gotham. The old woman who left an extra porch light burning because the bat watches the corners. The child who dressed as him for Halloween and carried a toy grappling hook made from string and cardboard. The stories were beginning to mutate, to become folklore. Fear was giving way to myth, and myth to belief. Batman had become something between urban legend and civic conscience. Gotham, for all its cynicism, was beginning to imagine itself worthy of protection. Still, every belief system demands a test. Gotham's test came in the form of escalation. When the criminals realized that superstition could no longer keep them safe, they adapted. The old gangsters, with their neat suits and predictable hierarchies, began to vanish, replaced by something more erratic criminals who embraced chaos rather than order. They didn't fear the Bat. They admired him. They painted their faces, donned masks of their own, and made a game of imitation. Gotham was evolving, and in its evolution, it was inventing its own monsters. Gordon saw the pattern too. The alliance between cop and vigilante, though fragile, had begun to produce results. Together, they toppled one of the city's oldest crime families, exposing ties that reached into City Hall. The cost was high officers suspended, careers destroyed, but it proved that Gotham's rot was not inevitable. Gordon often found himself defending Batman in closed-door meetings, where superiors called the vigilante a menace. He never claimed to know who the man was. He simply said the results spoke for themselves. Behind the mask, Bruce took that trust seriously. He knew that if he failed, Gordon's integrity would go with him. Wayne Enterprises became his other battlefield. By day, Bruce attended board meetings with the same focus he used on patrols. Corporate acquisitions masked his search for technologies that could aid his crusade. New polymers, advanced surveillance systems, experimental vehicles. To the public, he was a distracted heir, a symbol of indulgence in a city of need. In truth, he was converting wealth into defense, excess into efficiency. It amused him that the same tabloids that mocked his late-night parties unknowingly funded his war on crime through rising stock prices. At times, the distance between Bruce Wayne and Batman felt unbearable. Bruce was expected to smile, to shake hands, to speak at charity galas that funded the very neighborhoods he patrolled hours later. The mask he wore in daylight was far heavier than the one he used at night. Alfred, ever the quiet compass, reminded him that both identities were performances, each necessary to sustain the other. "The world sees Bruce Wayne and relaxes," he once said. "That's how Batman can work. You've built yourself to myths, and both need to be believable." As months passed, Gotham itself began to respond in kind. The skyline gleamed a little brighter, construction cranes peppered the horizon, and crime statistics dropped just enough for headlines to take notice. Yet, beneath the optimism, the power vacuum left by the mob wars drew new contenders, more unpredictable, more theatrical. Crime in Gotham was evolving into something symbolic, as if the city were answering Batman's myth with myths of its own. The game was changing from control to ideology. It was during this period that the first hints of the future appeared. A man in a green suit leaving riddles at crime scenes. A thief whose crimes resembled choreography more than greed. An asylum psychiatrist who seemed far too fascinated by criminal minds. Bruce felt it like static before a storm, the sense that Gotham was preparing to test not his body, but his belief. Fear had given him dominance. Now the city was about to ask if conviction could do the same. One evening, standing over the East End, he watched the city lights flicker across the river. From that height, Gotham looked peaceful, almost beautiful. But he knew beauty in Gotham was always temporary, a pause between crises. He had returned to save the city from itself, and in the process had become part of its design. Gotham did not reject him. It absorbed him, reshaped itself around him, mirrored his duality in its every brick and shadow. The Bat had not just changed Gotham. Gotham had changed to accommodate the Bat. Every victory brought a new mutation. The city had learned to fear the dark again, but now it was learning to worship it too. Somewhere in the balance between those two emotions, Batman found purpose. He was no longer fighting to avenge the dead boy in the alley. He was fighting to keep the living city from dying in the same ways, lowly, quietly, with no one left to bear witness. And as the night wind carried the sound of sirens through the streets, he felt, for the first time, that he was not merely haunting Gotham, he was keeping it alive. The city breathes differently when it rains. Gotham's storms do not cleanse, they reveal, they wash the filth down to the gutters, but the stains remain, soaked into the foundation like ink on old paper. On nights like that, the glow of streetlights bends through the mist, and the skyline looks like a memory of itself, half beautiful, half diseased. From the rooftops, Batman listens to it all, the rhythm of tires on wet pavement, the distant hum of sirens, the pulse of a city both asleep and scheming. He has been at this long enough to sense the subtle changes in its behavior, and he can tell something in Gotham is about to shift again. In the earliest months, his war had been one-sided. He struck from shadows, the city reacted, and the pattern repeated. But now, the city had begun to respond with intelligence of its own. Gotham's criminals were organizing in ways he hadn't seen before. The old mobsters, stripped of their empires, were evolving. Their methods were less about business and more about spectacle. It was as if the city's underworld had realized that to survive, it had to become theatrical, because Gotham itself was watching. Each encounter felt more like a conversation than a fight, as if the darkness was testing what kind of creature he had become. He faced enemies who mirrored his own tactics. The Riddler, who turned deduction into performance. Scarecrow, who weaponized fear with chemicals instead of symbols. Two-Face, the fallen idealist who measured justice with a coin's flip. These were not merely criminals, they were reflections, each one shaped by the same city that had made him. He began to understand that Gotham wasn't just producing monsters, it was balancing an equation. Two-Face had once been Harvey Dent, the city's shining light, a friend and ally who believed Gotham could be saved through law instead of legend. Bruce had admired him for that hope, but one act of violence, one vat of acid, and Dent's face and mind split in two. Half the man remained the prosecutor who believed in justice. The other half worshipped chance. When Batman looked at him, he saw not an enemy, but a prophecy. What could happen if conviction ever gave way to despair? Scarecrow, on the other hand, was science-gone Jonathan Crane, a psychologist obsessed with the mechanics of terror. His fear toxin stripped away the facades people built around themselves, reducing them to raw panic. Bruce studied the formula, analyzed the chemicals, and realized how thin the line was between his own use of fear and Crane's. The difference wasn't the method, it was the intention. Batman wielded fear to prevent harm. Scarecrow wielded it to understand and control it. But on certain nights, that distinction felt fragile. The Riddler was something else, entirely an intellect without morality, obsessed with proving superiority through puzzles. His crimes were less about money than validation. Each riddle left at a crime scene was a taunt, a dare for Batman to fail. Solving them was never about pride for Bruce. It was about understanding the kind of man who needed chaos to feel alive. But deep down, he recognized the same obsessive need to impose order, to make sense of the senseless. Edward Nygma had taken that instinct and stripped it of compassion. Batman had simply refined it. Through them, Gotham began to teach him that villains were not anomalies, they were outcomes. For every action he took, the city produced a reaction. Each time he raised the bar for fear, Gotham raised its own for madness. The line between cause and consequence blurred until he couldn't always tell which side of it he stood on. Alfred warned him that fighting monsters often means learning their language too well. Even your reflection can start answering back if you stare long enough, he said one morning as he patched another wound. Bruce didn't argue. He just nodded, knowing that Alfred wasn't wrong. The partnership with Gordon deepened during this time. Their alliance had evolved from necessity to trust, quiet, unspoken understanding that both men were fighting the same disease from different ends. Gordon cleaned the rot within the law. Batman handled what the law couldn't reach. They shared intelligence, coordinated raids, and began to build an invisible bridge between legitimacy and myth. In a city like Gotham, that bridge was the only thing standing between order and collapse. Yet, for every small victory, the city exacted a price. The nights grew longer, the wounds deeper, the faces of those he couldn't save sharper in memory. There were children caught in crossfire, officers corrupted beyond redemption, victims who mistook him for another threat. Bruce carried each one quietly, storing their stories like stones in a cathedral. They reminded him why the rule existed: no killing, no crossing that line. The vow wasn't for mercy's sake. It was to keep him tethered to humanity in a city built to strip it away. It wasn't lost on him that while he fought to preserve Gotham's soul, the world outside its skyline was wrestling with its own shadows. The news spoke of wars justified by fear, governments spying in the name of safety, and corporations that had learned to weaponize chaos for profit. Gotham was no different. It was simply louder, more honest about its sickness. It mirrored the real world's anxieties, its hunger for control, and its moral fatigue. The city was a stage on which those fears wore masks, and Batman was both actor and audience. There were moments when he questioned the purpose of it all. Could a symbol really heal a system that had learned to feed on its own corruption? Each night he returned to the cave, shedding the armor piece by piece, and wondered if Gotham had grown dependent on him in the same way an addict depends on its drug. What if the presence meant to inspire hope only prolonged the disease? Alfred once said, "You can't fight decay with permanence. You can only delay it." Bruce didn't have an answer, only another night's work ahead of him. Still, amid the exhaustion, there were glimpses of what he fought for. A police precinct that no longer took bribes. A block of tenements repainted by volunteers instead of gang signs. A mother walking home under a streetlight that hadn't been smashed in months. These small mercies weren't victories, they were signals, proof that Gotham, in its own battered way, could respond to care as much as to fear. Standing atop the Narrows one night, Batman looked out over the city, the rain settling into his cape like the weight of memory. He could see both sides of Gotham in a single glance, the corruption and the endurance, the madness and the mercy. It struck him that he was not simply fighting for the city. He was part of its evolution, for better or worse. Every new villain, every ally, every terrified whisper was a reflection of his existence. He had set something in motion the night he first put on the cowl, and there was no going back. The city and the man were now mirrors of one another, fractured, unyielding, and impossibly alive. Gotham would never be cured, and Bruce Wayne had stopped believing it could be, but so long as it kept breathing, so long as there were alleys that remembered loss and rooftops that whispered resistance, he would be there, silent, relentless, and human enough to keep trying. The first dawns of calm never lasted long in Gotham. The city, as if allergic to stillness, always found a way to summon a new storm. But this one was different. It didn't come from the streets or the mob, not from the chaos of the Narrows or the corruption of City Hall. It came from somewhere quieter, somewhere more personal. Gotham had begun to change, and so had he. For the first time, Batman's mission no longer belonged only to him. It began with an acrobat falling from a broken trapeze. The night was supposed to be a distraction, a charity gala at the circus, the kind of performance Bruce Wayne attended to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But when the rope snapped and the boy's scream cut through the tent, something ancient stirred in him. The crowd gasped, the spotlight went white, and the boy's parents lay motionless under the rigging. In that moment, Bruce didn't see the child's face. He saw his own reflection in a mirror 30 years old. He found the boy later, sitting in the police station with his fists clenched and eyes emptied of light. Dick Grayson, 12 years old, orphaned by someone else's greed. Bruce didn't intend to take him in at first. He had no interest in playing guardian. His mission allowed no room for tenderness. But grief recognizes itself. When Dick looked at him, he saw something familiar, someone who understood what it meant to have the world collapse without warning. Against every instinct he had built, Bruce brought him home. Wayne Manor felt different, with another heartbeat inside it. Alfred approved quietly, though his eyes carried the weight of knowing what responsibility this meant. Bruce trained the boy, not because he wanted a partner, but because he understood that unchanneled pain becomes poison. Dick was fast, graceful, determined. What he lacked in experience, he replaced with resilience. Bruce recognized the same fire that had once driven him into the shadows, but in Dick it burned warmer, lighter. The first nights of training were filled with tension, to survivors testing the edges of their pain. Bruce taught him combat, deduction, discipline, but Dick taught Bruce something he hadn't expected. Hope could exist alongside purpose. The boy laughed during training, sometimes even while he fell, was jarring. That sound laughter echoing in the same halls where Bruce had once walked in silence. Over time, the manor's emptiness began to fill with something human again. When Dick first put on the mask, Bruce almost stopped him. The idea of another child stepping into the darkness felt like a betrayal of everything he'd sworn to prevent. But Dick wasn't seeking revenge, he was seeking justice. That difference, subtle as it was, mattered. Robin was born, not as a shadow of Batman, but as the light that cut through his silhouette. Together, they became something Gotham had never seen: balance. The effect on the city was immediate. Criminals, once terrified of the Bat's silence, now faced a duo, one cloaked in fear, the other in motion and light. Batman struck with precision. Robin struck with speed. It was a partnership that turned myth into choreography. Word spread quickly. The Bat wasn't alone anymore. That fact alone unsettled the Underworld. Gotham's predators had always believed fear fed on isolation. Now it seemed courage did too. In time, Bruce realized that having a partner changed more than tactics. It altered his perspective. Patrols became conversations. Missions became lessons. Robin questioned methods, challenged orders, and sometimes defied them outright. Where Bruce saw inevitability, Dick saw choice. Gotham, filtered through the boy's optimism, looked less like a wound and more like a patient that could be healed. Bruce didn't always agree, but he couldn't deny the truth in it. The partnership also caught Gordon's attention. He saw the dynamic firsthand one night after a raid on Black Mask's drug lab. Batman handled the assault. Robin handled the evacuation of hostages. When the dust settled, Gordon asked, "You trust him?" Bruce's answer was simple. "More than I trust myself." But as the Bat and Robin found rhythm, Gotham found new ways to test them. The rogues adapted against smarter, crueler, hungrier for attention. The Joker returned with elaborate crimes designed not to steal but to mock, turning every victory into theater. Two-Face struck at the city's legal system, targeting judges and prosecutors, forcing Bruce to confront the limits of mercy. It became clear that the war on crime was no longer personal, it had become generational. Bruce began to understand legacy, not as inheritance, but as continuation. What he had built was not meant to end with him. The mission had to outlast the man. Robin was proof of that, proof that hope could survive even after trauma, that the symbol of the Bat could evolve into something better. Watching Dick grow, Bruce found himself wondering whether he was teaching the boy to fight crime or teaching him to someday live without it. Still, the city never stopped reminding him what it cost to care. The loss of Jason Todd years later would carve that lesson deeper than he ever imagined. But that was still in the future. For now, in those early years, Bruce allowed himself something dangerously close to peace. On rare nights after patrol, they would return to the cave, exhausted but alive, the hum of the computers mixing with the faint sound of laughter echoing off stone. Alfred would set out tea, pretending not to watch the two of them. "You've managed the impossible," he said once, drying a cup with quiet pride. "You've made the night a little less lonely." Bruce didn't answer. He just looked across the cave at the boy, checking his gear, humming under his breath. Outside, Gotham's skyline shimmered against a restless sky. The city was still broken, still cruel, but not hopeless. The Batman, who once fought alone, now fought alongside, a reminder of what he was trying to protect: innocence that refused to die. In that partnership, fear and light, vengeance and grace, Gotham found something it hadn't had in generations. Not salvation, but balance. And for Bruce, that was enough to keep the vow alive. Not because it redeemed him, but because it proved he wasn't the city's only chance. The mission had grown beyond the man, and somewhere in the dark, Gotham's heart had started to beat in time with his own. The years that followed were quieter, only in appearance. Gotham had settled into an uneasy rhythm, a pattern of darkness and reprieve that almost felt like balance. With Robin beside him, Batman had brought a kind of order to the night. The mobs were fractured, the major crime families cautious, and the police under Gordon's leadership more capable than they had been in decades. For a moment, Gotham seemed to breathe without choking. But cities like Gotham don't heal, they adapt. And when they adapt, they mutate. The old, predictable crimes of greed and power began to give way to something stranger: madness, dressed as meaning. It was as if the fear that once kept Gotham's monsters in hiding had been replaced by something worse: fascination. They no longer feared Batman. They wanted his attention. The Joker was the first to prove it. His crimes had always been cruel, but now they were personal, almost conversational. He didn't steal for wealth or power. He orchestrated chaos to make a point that the world was only ever one bad day away from turning into him. Each encounter with him pushed Bruce closer to the edge of that idea. The Joker saw Batman not as an enemy, but as a reflection. They were, in his words, two sides of the same joke. That was the trap. The Joker wanted Batman to break his code, to kill him, to cross the line that separated purpose from obsession. And though Bruce never gave in, the temptation haunted him. There were nights when he looked at the clown's painted grin and understood, for an instant, the seductive logic of ending it permanently. But that path led back to the alley, back to the gun and the boy. The vow wasn't about mercy. It was about not becoming what the city had already made of everyone else. Harvey Dent's fall had been another lesson. Once Gotham's brightest hope, now its cruelest irony. Two-Face embodied the city's dual nature, idealism and decay, justice and vengeance. Every time Bruce faced him, it felt less like combat and more like dialogue. Harvey's coin flips were sermons about chance, about the futility of control. Sometimes Bruce wondered if Harvey was right, if Gotham's morality had always been a coin toss, waiting to land on its edge. It wasn't just villains testing limits. The system Bruce had fought to strengthen was evolving too. Gordon's reforms had brought new officers, younger and braver, who saw Batman not as a monster, but as a necessary partner. But with that came dependency. There were whispers in the GCPD that justice didn't work unless the Bat showed up. It was never what Bruce intended, but it was inevitable. Symbols inspire as much reliance as they do courage. The partnership with Robin continued, but the boy was growing. Dick was restless, confident, ready to be more than a shadow. Bruce had always known this day would come, the moment when the student outgrew the teacher. Their arguments grew sharper. Bruce demanded precision. Dick demanded trust. The mission had made them family, but it also made them opposites. Where Bruce saw structure, Dick saw suffocation. One night, after a particularly brutal patrol, they stood on a rooftop overlooking the East End. The city was calm for once, the sky soft with dawn. Dick turned to him and said, "You can't save Gotham by holding your breath, Bruce. You have to let it breathe." Bruce didn't answer. He knew the boy was right, but acknowledging it felt like loosening his own armor. Eventually, Dick left Gotham to become his own symbol Nightwing. It hurt more than Bruce admitted. Alfred tried to remind him that this was success, not lost, that the true measure of a teacher was when the student no longer needed him. But the cave felt emptier again, and Bruce found himself patrolling longer hours, slipping back into the solitude that once defined him. Without Robin's warmth, the nights grew heavier. Gotham's criminals seemed to sense it, as if they could smell the absence of light. Scarecrow resurfaced with a new toxin, one that didn't just induce fear, but exposed truth-forcing victims to confront what they truly were afraid of. When Batman inhaled it during a raid, he found himself back in Crime Alley, hearing the gunshot, smelling the smoke. Only this time, he wasn't the boy. He was the man holding the gun. He woke from the hallucination, shaking. The image burned into his mind. Fear, he realized, was not something he had conquered, it was something he had merely domesticated. There were other threats, too. Bane arrived from somewhere far beyond Gotham, a figure of both intellect and brute strength. A strategist who saw the Bat not as a legend, but as a problem to be solved. Bane studied him, mapped his tactics, broke him down piece by piece, until the final confrontation left Bruce literally shattered, his back broken, his mission stripped from him. For months, he could do nothing but watch as another man wore the cowl, turning Batman's name into something crueler, bloodier. It was a nightmare made real, the symbol used without the code. Recovery was not quick, nor was it purely physical. As his body healed, Bruce began to reconsider what Batman meant, not just to Gotham, but to himself. He realized that the mission had never been about perfection. It was about persistence. Even when broken, even when the symbol was stolen, the idea had to endure. That was the test. By the time he returned, Gotham was worse for his absence, but not lost. There were still people willing to fight for it. Gordon, now older but steadfast, new allies emerging in unexpected places, and Dick, whose independence had not erased his loyalty. Together, they reclaimed the city. Batman was back, scarred but unbroken, the myth reforged in failure. Gotham had changed again, and so had he. The city had learned that it could survive without him for a time, and Bruce had learned that he could not be its only savior. He was part of something larger, now a legacy, not a crusade. The bat was no longer just his burden. It was Gotham's shared reflection, an ever-shifting mirror that showed the city what it could be at its best, and what it feared becoming at its worst. On the first night, after reclaiming his mantle, he stood once more above the skyline. The wind carried the smell of rain and the faint electric hum of a city that refused to sleep. Below him, the streets glittered with 1,000 small, defiant headlights. Windows, neon signs, each one proof that Gotham, in its own broken way, still lived. He had built his life on a promise made by a child. Decades later, the promise was still being kept, not perfectly, not forever, but enough. Enough to keep the night honest. Enough to remind the city that even in its deepest darkness, there was always someone still watching, still trying. And that, Bruce decided, was what endurance really meant. Time in Gotham doesn't move forward. It loops. Every generation thinks it's witnessing the city's rebirth, only to realize it's just another turn of the wheel. For Bruce, the pattern had become almost predictable. Chaos, resistance, restoration, decay cycle, teaching him that Gotham's greatest strength was its refusal to die. He was older now, the sharp edges of youth worn down by decades of war in the shadows. The mission had not ended. It had evolved. The cave had grown quieter. The hum of technology replaced the echo of laughter that used to fill it. Dick was long gone, leading his own city with the confidence of someone who had learned from both Batman's brilliance and his flaws. Jason's memory lingered like an unhealed scarring, and guilt intertwined into something he carried but never named. Tim Drake had stepped in next, the boy who had deduced his identity simply by noticing patterns others missed. Tim wasn't driven by vengeance or tragedy. He was driven by intellect, by curiosity, by the need to make sense of chaos. Bruce saw in him the detective he had always wanted to be, untainted by rage. Each of them had taken something from him, but they'd also left something behind. Different interpretation of what it meant to wear the symbol. That Bruce realized was the true legacy of the bat. It was never meant to be owned. It was meant to be inherited, reshaped by those who needed it most. But legacy comes with a price. Gotham, ever the mirror, began to challenge the idea of permanence. New forces rose, not from greed or fear, but from belief. The League of Assassins returned. Their leader, Ra's al Ghul, convinced that Batman was more than a man, that he was a potential successor, the heir to an eternal mission. The world decays because it lacks the courage to purge itself, Ra's said once, standing over the Lazarus Pit's green glow. You and I are the same. Detective, we simply disagree on the price of order. Bruce knew the offer was seductive. Immortality, finality, an end to Gotham's endless repetition, but he refused. His war was never meant to end the world's chaos. It was meant to resist it, Roz fought for perfection. Bruce fought for persistence. The difference was everything. It was during this era that another figure entered his life, Talia, Ra's al Ghul's daughter, equal parts adversary and temptation. Their connection was complicated, a fragile bridge between war and understanding. From that brief union came Damien, a child born into both extremes, heir to the League's discipline and the Bat's code. Training him was like facing a reflection of his younger self, unyielding, brilliant, reckless. Damien questioned every rule, every mercy, every hesitation. "Why not kill those who deserve it?" he asked once, his tone devoid of malice, only logic. Bruce's answer was simple but firm, because once you start, you stop being part of what you're trying to protect. Damien's arrival rekindled something in Bruce that had long gone dormant, a sense of future, but it also reopened old wounds. Fatherhood was foreign to him. He had mentored, guided, even loved in his own silent way, but never truly been a father. Now, the role demanded more than he had ever given. Damien wasn't a sidekick. He was an heir who needed something Bruce had never been taught to provide: grace. Outside the walls of Wayne Manor, Gotham continued its dance between progress and decay. The skyline gleamed brighter than ever, glass towers reflecting artificial light, but beneath it, the same shadows stretched long. Crime no longer wore simple faces. It had become systemic, digital, institutional. The Joker's chaos had given way to something colder: the Court of Owls, an ancient society that claimed to have guided Gotham's destiny for centuries. They operated not through madness, but through control. Politicians, judges, billionaires, all masked, all believing themselves the true architects of the city. When Bruce discovered them, it was like uncovering the city's secret skeleton. Every major decision, every tragedy, every triumph, connected to invisible strings that led back to the court. It shook him in a way even the Joker never had. He had spent his life believing that Gotham was broken because of neglect and corruption, not because it was designed to be. The revelation forced him to see that he had never been fighting disease. He had been fighting design. The war with the court nearly killed him. Their assassins, the Talons, moved like ghosts, trained across generations to silence rebellion before it spoke. For the first time in years, Batman found himself outnumbered and outpaced. But it wasn't brute strength that won, it was faith. Faith in his allies, in the city itself. Nightwing returned to fight beside him. Tim coordinated from the cave. Even Damien, defiant and fearless, held his ground. The Bat family, fragmented, scarred, but unbroken, reminded Gotham that symbols cannot be silenced by secrets. In the aftermath, as the city rebuilt again, Bruce stood beneath the clock tower that led down into the cave. Alfred was gone by then, his absence a silence deeper than any wound. The mansion felt hollow without the familiar sound of his voice, without the quiet wisdom that had once steadied him. Bruce often found himself speaking into that emptiness, answering questions no one had asked aloud. "We did it again," he'd say after a long night, almost as if expecting the butler to reply. For now, Gotham moved forward, and so did he, slower, more deliberate, but never at rest. The city no longer feared him. It relied on him. Children wore his emblem on Halloween. News anchors spoke of him with reverence rather than suspicion. The myth had solidified into folklore, and yet, for all his victories, he remained vigilant, because he knew better than anyone that Gotham's peace was cyclical. The bat signal still lit the clouds when needed, though the nights between calls grew longer. Standing on the same rooftops where he had once stalked his first prey, Bruce watched his city exhale. It wasn't healed, not really, but it was enduring, and that was enough. He thought often of his father, then not the man who died in the alley, but the doctor who once said that saving one life was enough reason to keep trying. Maybe that was all the Bat had ever been, one man's attempt to save a single life over and over again, in 1,000 different ways. As dawn broke, he turned away from the skyline, the cape brushing against the wind like a curtain closing on a long act. Gotham would survive him. He knew that now, and maybe, finally, that was the point. The legend he built had become bigger than the man who wore it. Batman was no longer a crusade. He was continuity, a promise, whispered through generations that the night would always have a watcher. Bruce had started as a boy trying to stop a crime. He had become a man holding back a city's collapse. And somewhere along the way, without realizing it, he had turned into something eternal. The light on the horizon rose higher, touching the towers and the gargoyles, washing the city in gold. For once, Gotham didn't look haunted, it looked alive. And as the first rays touched the bat signal, Bruce let himself exhale, not in victory, but in peace. The mission, at last, could outlive him. There comes a point when even the shadows grow tired. Bruce had lived long enough to watch Gotham change its face again and again. New towers, new villains, new generations, wearing the same bruises. He had outlasted the crime families, the madmen, the councils in masks. Even the bat signal seemed older now, its beam thinner, its light more memory than warning. The mission that had begun in one man's grief had become an inheritance passed through time. But inheritance always asks the same question. What happens when the hand that built it lets go? His body had begun to answer that question for him. Bones healed slower. Muscles carried ghosts of pain long past. Every motion now was an act of will rather than instinct. The armor was heavier, not because it had changed, but because he had. Nights that used to vanish into motion now stretched, deliberate, careful. Yet the city still called, and he still answered. Gotham's pulse had slowed, but it hadn't stopped hand, neither would he. Wayne Manor had become more than home. It was history itself. The cave below, once a forge of invention and strategy, was quieter. Tim handled much of the coordination now, his mind a map of Gotham's networks, both digital and physical. Barbara Gordon, the Oracle, watched over the family from her tower of screens, her voice calm and steady, even as the next generation moved through the alleys Bruce once claimed as his own. Nightwing's leadership had grown into something larger than sidekickhood. He had become what Bruce never could be, a symbol that inspired without fear. Damian patrolled differently, sharper, angrier, but learning, always learning. Sometimes, standing in the cave, Bruce would listen to their voices over the coms and realize they didn't need him to speak. They didn't even need him to lead. The city's defense had outgrown its architect. There was melancholy in that truth, but also relief. For the first time since that night in Crime Alley, Bruce could imagine a Gotham that didn't collapse when he stopped breathing. Yet peace, even in imagination, was never a constant here. From beyond the stars came threats greater than any mob or madman, the kind of chaos that reduced cities to symbols, and symbols to whispers. Batman had once sworn to be a local guardian, a creature of rooftops and alleys. But the world had changed around him. He stood beside God's Nowan, alien wrapped in sunlight, an Amazon born of myth, a scarred detective from another city who called him friend. Together, they fought wars that redefined mortality. But even in the orbit of cosmic power, Bruce never forgot the rule that built him. Every world is just a city on a larger map. He never wanted to be eternal. But legends don't ask permission. Over time, the myth of the bat became self-sustaining. Even when he disappeared for months, sightings persisted. Some were false, some weren't. The idea of Batman had grown beyond one man's endurance. Gotham had made him immortal, not through science or magic, but through necessity. The city needed its ghost. Still, the man beneath the mask remained human. Alfred's absence had carved out a silence nothing could fill. Bruce sometimes caught himself setting 2 cups of tea on the desk, forgetting until the steam rose from both. There were nights he sat in the study, no cowl, no armor, reading the old case files just to hear echoes of his own purpose. In those pages lived the ghosts of everyone he'd fought besides, some alive, some gone, all part of the same unfinished story. He began to write more notes, reflections, instructions, not manifestos, but lessons. Never trust certainty. Always leave the city better than you found it. Asterisk fear is not the enemy. Apathy is. Asterisk the journal wasn't for him. It was for whoever came after, the next child or dreamer who thought a single vow could save the world. He didn't want them to repeat his mistakes, though he knew they would. They'd learn, just as he had, that justice isn't victory, it's maintenance. And so the cycle continued. The villains changed masks. The politics changed slogans. The technology evolved from grappling hooks to drones, from steel to light. But the heart of it that danced between fear and hope remained the same. Gotham was still a creature of contradiction, to corrupt, to worship, to alive, to abandon. And somewhere in that contradiction, the bat still moved, slower now, but sure. One night, after a patrol that ended not in battle but in quiet observation, Bruce stood on the roof of the GCPD headquarters. The city below shimmered with neon and drizzle, the kind of light that softened everything it touched. Gordon was gone. A new commissioner held the office, someone who had grown up believing the bat was real, not rumor. When the signal flickered to life, Bruce stepped into it. The light painted his armor gold for an instant, washing away the years. He smiled faintly. "It's brighter than I remember," he said, to no one in particular. He stayed like that for a while, letting the city hum beneath him, the pulse he had spent a lifetime following. It wasn't fear that drove him anymore. It was stewardship. The vow had changed shape, from a promise of revenge to an act of guardianship. He was no longer a boy, punishing fate, but a man ensuring that others could still believe in resistance. Eventually, dawn began to dissolve the night. The bats in the cave stirred somewhere behind him, sensing the shift. He turned away from the skyline, cape whispering against the wind. Somewhere out there, the next voice, the next fighter, was already watching, waiting, learning. Bruce descended from the rooftop and into the lightning mist, knowing what he had never allowed himself to admit before. The mission was complete, not when Gotham was safe, but when Gotham could protect itself. And as he disappeared into the thinning fog, the bat signal still burned against the clouds, its light, not a warning, but a benediction. The legend would remain. The man could finally rest. The city never stopped building. Gotham's skyline stretched higher now. The old gargoyles replaced by glass. The smog traded for something cleaner, but no less heavy. The streets pulsed with neon, with motion, with the hum of drones that replaced patrol cars. Decades had passed, but the architecture still whispered the same story. Power at the top, struggle at the bottom, hope flickering somewhere between. History here never vanished, just upgraded. On certain nights, when the rain turned the rooftops into mirrors, people swore they saw him. Not the man, but the shape. A flash of dark wings across a security camera feed, a shadow gliding between towers where no aircraft was logged. The city's sensors always blamed it on interference. People knew better. Gotham had always needed its ghosts. In this new era, the Bat wasn't flesh and bone anymore. He was myth layered onto infrastructure. The network that kept the city alive, the drones, the lights, the silent patrol algorithms, was written with his code. Oracle's systems had evolved into the Gotham defense grid, but deep within its protocols, one subroutine still bore an old name: Wayne Protocol, Sentinel Mode. When crime spiked in one district, the system adapted in silence. When a signal flickered on the horizon, citizens looked up out of instinct, even if there was no one left to answer it. But sometimes there was. Terry was young, reckless, and too much like Bruce in all the ways that made Alfred sigh decades earlier. He'd inherited the suit, though suit no longer did it justice. It was an extension of will-silent thrusters, neural sync armor that could think faster than human reflex. Yet inside it, the same heart still beat, the heart of someone who believed that Gotham, despite itself, was worth saving. He'd found the cave by accident, maybe destiny. The elevator had descended through layers of forgotten time, past dust-covered vehicles and cracked computer screens that hadn't glowed in years. There were bats, still ancient and loyal, circling above the relics, and in the center, the chair waited. The monitors flickered awake, lines of dormant code spilling to life. A voice emerged, not Alfred's, not quite Bruce's either. Something between the two, woven from memory and machine. "You found this place for a reason," it said, "or it found you, that was all." Then silence, except for the sound of the city breathing through the cave's old ventilation shafts. Bruce had been gone for years. How long? No one really knew. Some said he retired quietly. Some whispered he'd left Gotham altogether, seeking peace in a world that could never quite believe he existed. A few believed he still lived below, asleep, waiting for a crisis worthy of waking. Gotham, superstitious as ever, preferred not to question it. Terry didn't wear the mask to honor a man. He wore it to continue a principle. Gotham had evolved, but its disease hadn't. Corruption had gone corporate, digital, efficient. The villains wore suits again, just like in the beginning. And so the symbol returned, not as vengeance, not even as justice, but as reminder. Fear could still serve the innocent. One night, after a chase through the industrial district, he landed atop the new Wayne Tower. The city glowed beneath him, more electric than organic, but alive. He could feel its pulse in his gloves. The wind carried the scent of ozone instead of rain. He tapped the comlink embedded in his cowl, speaking softly to the AI that guided him. Was it always like this? He asked. The voice, patient and old, replied, always different, always the same. He stood there for a long time, watching the light shift across the buildings, and understood what Bruce must have felt all those years. The mixture of exhaustion and awe that comes from protecting something that never truly belongs to you. Gotham was still broken, but it was trying. Maybe that was enough. Far below, people moved like rivers through the streets, unaware of the eyes above them. A child pointed to the skyline, tugging their mother's hand. "Look," the kid said, "the bat's back." The mother smiled, dismissive but not certain. Maybe, she said. Maybe not. But for an instant, both of them looked up together, and the city felt lighter. In a control room, buried deep beneath the surface, a single monitor blinked a grainy security feed showing the rooftop. A figure in the chair leaned forward, older than the shadows around him. The corners of his mouth curved faintly, not quite a smile. He whispered, barely audible. Good, he found it. Then the screen dimmed, and Gotham continued its endless heartbeat, half myth, half machine. The world above believed it had outgrown legends, but Gotham never did. Here, the night still belonged to the Bativan, if the man who began it had finally found rest. Morning had finally found its way through the curtains of Wayne Manor. It came softly, as if the sun itself had learned to tread lightly in this house. Dust drifted through the air like lazy memories, catching the gold of the rising light. The manor had stood for centuries, absorbing laughter, loss, and the echoes of vows whispered in grief. It had outlasted them all, parents, sons, and the ghosts that made it sacred. Down in the cave, the air was cool and still. The machines no longer hummed with urgency. They rested, the servers blinking like fireflies. The Batmobile sat beneath a shroud of dust. The suitcases were sealed. Every mission file had been archived and locked. On the main console, a single line of text glowed faintly against the dark. System standby, awaiting new operator. He sat in the chair one last time. His hands, once steady, now trembling, traced the edges of the console. Every scar, every ache, every memory pulsed through his fingertips. He had built this life from loss and stubborn will. Now, for the first time, he felt the weight of both, not as burden, but as completion. Bruce had lived long enough to see Gotham survive him. He had seen the children he trained become protectors in their own right. Nightwing's laughter still echoed faintly in his mind, bright and confident. Barbara's voice, sharp, intelligent, endlessly compassionate, lingered like an anchor. Tim's curiosity, Jason's redemption, Damian's fierce resolve. They had all become living proof of what he once doubted was possible, that the symbol could evolve beyond him. He looked at the empty rack where the cowl had hung. For decades, that mask had been his face, the bridge between grief and duty. Now it was gone, passed on, perhaps, or simply unnecessary. Without it, Bruce Wayne looked less like the Batman and more like the man he was before the vow. Older, yes, but somehow lighter. The cave felt alive with memory. He could still hear Alfred's voice, gentle and unrelenting. "You've done enough, Master Wayne. It's all right to rest." He'd ignored that advice for years, too stubborn to believe rest and surrender weren't the same thing. But now he understood. Rest wasn't an ending, it was a lesson. Even the night needed its sunrise. He stood slowly, joints stiff but sure, and walked toward the old elevator. The motion sensors flickered on, bathing the cave in pale light. For a moment, the rock walls shimmered with reflections of his entire life: the boy with the candle in the alley, the man cloaked in shadow, the mentor watching others take flight. Each version of himself seemed to nod as he passed. At the elevator doors, he paused. There was no ceremony, no final speech, no audience to witness the end of the crusade. Just silence and the soft hum of the machines he'd built to outlast him. He placed one hand on the steel panel, entered a final command, and whispered the only word that ever felt sacred to him: enough. The lights dimmed, the console flickered once. The sound of the city above filtered faintly through the bedrock distant sirens, the rhythm of life continuing as it always had. Gotham no longer needed him to keep breathing. That realization filled him not with sadness, but peace. Outside, the manor's garden had overgrown with ivy and quiet beauty. Birds nested in the stone angels near the fountain. The air smelled of rain, the kind that promised renewal. Bruce stepped into it, the morning light brushing his face. Somewhere far beyond the trees, a signal light still burned in the clouds, maintained not out of fear, but tradition. A promise, not a plea. He walked slowly toward the horizon, not as a vigilante, but as a man who had given all he could. Each step felt lighter, as if the ground itself were finally forgiving him. When he reached the top of the hill overlooking the city, he stopped. Gotham stretched below, vibrant and endless, its towers alive with sunlight. It looked nothing like the place where his war began, yet in every gleaming surface he could still see the outlines of his past. The skyline wore his legacy like a scar that had healed without vanishing. He smiled not the grim smirk of the bat, but the quiet human smile of a man who had found peace in imperfection. For the first time in a lifetime, Bruce Wayne did not look at Gotham as something broken. He looked at it as something whole. And when the wind rose, brushing through the trees and across his coat, it carried with it a whisper soft, familiar, almost kind. "You did it, sir. It's all right now." He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the city's hum fade into the rustle of leaves. Somewhere, far below, in the depths of the cave, the sensors flickered for a brief second. The system, though shut down, detected motion a single shadow crossing the monitor, shaped like wings, then darkness again. The city would go on. The night would still fall. Someone, somewhere, would answer the call when it rose again. Because Gotham had never been saved by one man. It had always been saved by the belief that one man could, and in that belief, Batman would never die. The story of Batman begins, as it always does, with loss. A boy, standing in a narrow alley, watches the only light in his world fade beneath the flicker of a street lamp. The city moves on without him, as cities do, swallowing grief like smoke. But something stays behind, that nighttime echo, a vow, a promise whispered into the dark that Gotham would never again take what it did not deserve to keep. From that moment, Bruce Wayne's life became an argument against helplessness. Everything that followed the training, the discipline, the mask was a language built to speak that single word, never again. He disappeared from Gotham for years, a ghost haunting the corners of the world. He learned the anatomy of fear, the logic of crime, the architecture of deception. In forgotten temples, he studied control. In prisons, he studied cruelty. In silence, he studied himself. When he finally returned home, Gotham didn't recognize him. It had changed, but not for the better. The city was a living organism, rotting from its own marrow. Its police were compromised, its leaders corrupt, its people numb. Bruce realized that the city's sickness wasn't crime, it was apathy. Gotham didn't just need order, it needed faith in the idea of it. And so, in the space between what he was and what Gotham needed, he created something else. Batman was never meant to be a man. He was a response. The first nights were chaos. The symbol worked, but imperfectly. He was learning the rhythm of fear, understanding that it wasn't enough to fight criminals. He had to reshape how they thought. The shadows became his language. He struck from above, unseen, and in that invisibility, rumor replaced reason. People whispered. They said the devil had come to Gotham. That was enough. He worked with what he had: primitive tools, careful planning, and an unshakable conviction that the myth could outpace the man. His partnership with Jim Gordon began not with trust, but necessity. Over time, that necessity grew into something sacred. Gordon became the city's conscience, Batman its execution of will. Together, they built a fragile hope that still flickered even when everything else burned. But Gotham, as always, adapted. The more he defined himself, the more it defined its response. The city produced villains, the way a wound produces infection, and natural, grotesque, inevitable. They were not mere criminals, but reflections of his own crusade. The Riddler's obsession with logic, the Scarecrow's mastery of fear, Two-Face's fractured morality, all of them were extensions of the same equation, the balance between control and chaos. And then came the Joker, the one adversary who made the balance meaningless. The Joker didn't want order or power. He wanted conversation. His madness was theater, and Batman was his audience. He proved, over and over, that the line between sanity and obsession was razor thin, and Batman walked it every night. Even so, Gotham was never entirely cruel. In the midst of its decay, it offered Bruce something unexpected: connection. A boy named Dick Grayson, orphaned by tragedy, reminded him of what it meant to start again. Bruce took him in reluctantly, telling himself it was out of duty. But the truth was simpler. He didn't want another child to face the same abyss alone. Dick became Robin, a reflection not of darkness, but defiance against it. Their partnership softened the edges of the mission, turning vengeance into something closer to justice. Together, they became Gotham's balance: fear and hope in tandem, myth and light coexisting in motion. As time passed, the mission evolved, and so did those who shared it. There were victories, but also fractures. Jason Todd's death taught Bruce that even hope could be punished. Tim Drake's brilliance reignited purpose. Barbara Gordon became the city's unseen intelligence, her strength defined by endurance rather than fury. Damian Wayne, born of both legacy and conflict, forced Bruce to confront his own contradictions. Each of them carried his symbol differently, shaping the Bat into something larger than any one man. They were not soldiers, they were heirs, and the inheritance they carried was not power, but conviction. But Gotham, faithful to its pattern, never stayed still. It found new ways to challenge the myth. The Court of Owls revealed that even the foundations of the city were lies. Bane proved that will alone could be broken. The League of Assassins tested his morality against immortality. Yet through every trial, Bruce endured, not because he believed he could win, but because he refused to stop trying. That was the truth at the center of it all. Batman was never about victory. He was about endurance. Years became decades. The symbol changed hands. The city modernized, its skyline climbing higher, its corruption hidden behind cleaner glass. Gotham's monsters evolved into businessmen and technocrats, but the shadow of the Bat remained, coded into the city's architecture, whispered in alleys, painted on the sides of buildings by children who had never known him but still believed in his story. Even after Bruce's strength began to fail, the mission continued. Nightwing led his own city. Tim coordinated the next generation from the digital frontier. Barbara watched from her tower, turning data into defense. Damian fought with the fury of bloodline and purpose. And when a new face, young, reckless, and burning with potential, found his way into the cave, the legacy began again. Bruce lived long enough to see Gotham survive him. He watched it breathe on its own, imperfect and restless, but alive. For the first time, He understood that the vow made in blood and fear had fulfilled itself not by saving the city, but by teaching it how to save itself. When he finally stepped away, it wasn't defeat, it was acceptance. He turned off the machines, walked through the manor, and let the light find him. Gotham would endure. It always had. And so the legend became memory, and the memory became myth. People told stories, some true, some not, for a man who had turned fear into hope, of a city that had learned to look upward again. The bat signal still shone on cloudy nights, sometimes out of ritual, sometimes by mistake. But every time it did, people still looked up. That was the final victory, that the act of looking meant something. In the end, Bruce Wayne's life wasn't about conquest or even justice. It was about perseverance in a world that offered no guarantees. It was about refusing to yield to the darkness, even when the darkness was all that was left. His story closed, not with a roar, but with a quiet exhale from a man who had carried too much, for too long, and finally allowed himself to rest. Gotham moved forward, but it carried him with it, in every act of courage. In every night, someone decided to do the right thing when no one was watching. The vow that began in a narrow alley became an eternal rhythm. A man became a myth became a language, and the language became a promise that even in the darkest places, there would always be someone willing to stand watch. That was his gift to the city, and its gift to him in return. The knowledge that the night is never endless, so long as someone still believes in the dawn. There is a certain kind of silence that follows the end of a legend. It isn't the silence of absence, but of reflection, the sound of a world catching its breath after generations of myth. When the last battle is fought, when the mask is hung, or the wand laid down, what remains isn't the magic or the machinery, but the human shape beneath it. Batman's story, at its heart, belongs to that tradition of modern mythology, the same lineage that gave us a boy in a cupboard, a god among men, and a fellowship that walked into fire. Each of these stories begins with loss, wrestles with fear, and ends not with perfection, but with understanding. Harry Potter and Bruce Wayne are born of the same wound, two children standing in the ashes of what made them whole, each marked by the violence of a world they never chose. Both are orphans who inherit the task of turning trauma into meaning. For Harry, the scar becomes a symbol of survival. For Bruce, the bat becomes a declaration. The difference lies in how they learn to carry their pain. Harry is guided toward love. Bruce guides himself toward control. Yet, beneath those differences, both are children who refused to let death define them. Where Harry finds his sanctuary in Hogwarts, a place where the impossible becomes instruction, Bruce finds his in Gotham, a city that teaches through cruelty. Hogwarts offers him community, mentorship, and the reassurance that the world can still hold wonder. Gotham offers none of that. It is his classroom of shadows, his crucible of fear. For every charm Harry learns to cast outward, Bruce learns a different kind of spell, one that hides him, sharpens him, turns fear into armor. Both men learn early that symbols are stronger than spells. The lightning bolt and the bat are languages of myth, instantly understood even by those who do not know the full story. Children recognize them before they learn their histories. In that way, both worlds operate on the same emotional current. They make the invisible visible. Magic in Harry's world is literal, shaped into color and motion. Magic in Bruce's world is psychological, buried in the suggestion of what might be hiding in the dark. One lifts the curtain between worlds. The other reminds us why we draw it closed. Dumbledore and Alfred share a strange kinship. They are teachers of restraint, guardians of conscience. Dumbledore warns Harry that power without humility corrupts absolutely. Alfred warns Bruce that obsession without compassion destroys quietly. Both are father figures, defined not by what they give, but by what they prevent. They teach their wards to temper righteousness with mercy, to understand that the greatest act of heroism is knowing when not to act. It is the kind of lesson only the wiser, the weary can offer. Even their enemies reflect each other. Voldemort and the Joker, at their cores, are not just villains, but distortions of the same idea. The pursuit of control at the expense of humanity. Voldemort seeks to conquer death itself, to exist without the vulnerability that makes life meaningful. The Joker seeks to annihilate meaning entirely, to prove that life is nothing but chaos wearing a smile. Each defines themselves through their hero's morality, testing it, mocking it, trying to infect it. And in both stories, the hero's victory lies not in defeating evil, but in refusing to become it. There is a shared truth hidden in their journeys, that courage is not born from power, but from limitation. Harry's magic cannot bring back his parents, and Bruce's wealth cannot bring back his. The miracle lies not in what they can do, but in what they continue to do, despite knowing how little control they truly have. Their victories are temporary, their peace fragile, their sacrifices permanent. Yet they persist, not because they expect reward, but because they understand something sacred about fear. It is not to be banished, but mastered. In both universes, fear is the teacher. It is the boggart in the cupboard and the shadow in the alley. It takes different forms, but asks the same question. What will you do when the thing you dread most finds you? For Harry, the answer is compassion. For Bruce, it is conviction. Both responses are valid. Both are human. They show two sides of the same survival, one fueled by love, the other by will. If Hogwarts is a place where wonder is institutionalized, then Gotham is a place where faith is improvised. Harry's world believes in destiny, in chosen ones, in prophecies that shape the future. Bruce's world rejects prophecy entirely. It believes in the ordinary man who decides to make himself extraordinary. Harry's fate is written in a scar. Bruce's is written in his refusal to stop. Both represent different forms of belief, one in the universe's kindness, the other in the self's endurance. And when you strip away the magic and the gadgets, the wand and the cowl, you find the same soul beneath both legends. A child who learned to live in a world that had already shown him its cruelty. Harry found a way to forgive it. Bruce found a way to fight it. Both, in their own ways, became symbols of what it means to face darkness without surrender. Perhaps that is why these stories endure. They remind us that grief can be a beginning, not an end. That meaning can be made from pain, and hope can be reborn in fear's shadow. The wizard and the detective are, in truth, the same archetype told in different languages, one of light, one of night, and both tell us the same thing, that courage is not about defeating evil, but about choosing every day not to let it define you. There are few contrasts in storytelling as pure as the one between Batman and Superman, between the man who hides in darkness and the one who draws power from the sun. Yet their stories are not opposites. They are halves of the same meditation on humanity's place between fear and faith. If Harry Potter and Bruce Wayne both began as children of loss, Superman and Batman represent what those children might become. Two answers to the same question of what we should do with power once we have it. Superman's world begins in light. His origin is a gesture of compassion from another civilization, a gift sent to Earth from a dying planet, carrying not just strength but hope. Everything about him radiates grace. He is invulnerable, incorruptible, a man who literally draws life from the sun. He is the dream of what humanity wishes it could be. Bruce Wayne, on the other hand, is what humanity actually is, flawed, fearful, and persevering anyway. His world begins in blood and silence. He doesn't fall from the heavens. He crawls from an alley. Together, they form a complete myth. Superman shows us what perfection looks like. Batman shows us what persistence feels like. One asks, what if we were gods? The other asks, what if gods never came? Their contrast is not opposition, it's balance. Metropolis and Gotham are the same city, viewed through different lenses. One from daylight, one from midnight. Superman trusts in the goodness of people. Batman prepares for when that goodness fails. Clark Kent saves lives because he believes they are inherently worth saving. Bruce saves them because he refuses to accept the alternative. It is faith and skepticism in conversation. When Superman flies, he invites the world to look up. When Batman falls from the rooftops, he reminds the world to keep standing. The beauty of their friendship lies in that tension. Neither can fully understand the other, yet both need the other to define their own boundaries. Superman teaches Bruce that hope is not naive. Bruce teaches Clark that morality must be enforced, not assumed. Their relationship mirrors something deeply human, our internal argument between idealism and realism. Superman is the voice that says things will get better if we believe. Batman is the voice that says they won't unless we act. The balance between them is not a compromise, but a rhythm. When one fails, the other sustains. And when they stand together, they create a moral equilibrium that neither could achieve alone. In a larger sense, Superman is mythology reborn from ancient scripture, the God who walks among mortals, offering redemption without judgment. His powers are divine. His heart is unshakably kind. Batman is the myth of the self-made saint, the man who achieves the impossible, not by grace, but by grit. Where Superman saves through inspiration, Batman saves through imitation. He is proof that heroism can be built, not inherited. The way each uses fear also reveals their philosophies. Superman rejects it entirely. His presence banishes it. Batman wields it like a scalpel. Superman tells the frightened child that the world is safe. Batman tells the frightened child that the world is dangerous, but you can survive it anyway. The former offers comfort, the latter strength. They are both right. Even their vulnerabilities are reflections of each other. Superman's weakness is physical kryptonite, a mineral from a home he can never return to. Batman's weakness is emotional, the memory of a home he can never rebuild. Each is haunted by their origin, bound to it as both motivation and wound, and yet each continues to act in spite of it. That is what makes them mythic. If Superman embodies divinity made human, Batman embodies humanity aspiring toward divinity. One falls from the sky to teach compassion. The other rises from the earth to prove resilience. Together, they show us that heroism is not about power, but about perspective. Superman's faith in humanity gives us light. Batman's lack of faith forces us to deserve it. Without one, the other becomes hollow hope without preparation, or caution without compassion. When they fight, as legends occasionally require them to, it is never truly about victory. It's about the question they've been asking since their first encounter. Can the world be saved by belief, or only by will? Each time, the answer is the same. Both are necessary, because the world, like Gotham and Metropolis, lives in a twilight between those two truths. Superman's immortality invites awe, but Batman's mortality invites reflection. We can never be Superman, and that is his tragedy. But we can all be Batman, and that is his burden. He reminds us that meaning is not found in perfection, but in endurance. In that way, he and Clark are not rivals. They are teachers of the same lesson through different dialects of hope. And in their shared silence, standing together at the edge of dawn, the city of glass to the east, the city of stone to the west, you can almost see the story for what it truly is. Not a contest between light and dark, but a portrait of balance. The god watches the horizon to remind the world it can rise. The mortal stands in shadow to make sure it does. Between them lies the entire spectrum of what it means to be human. There are stories that end in peace, and there are stories that end in endurance. The Lord of the Rings belongs to the first kind, and Batman's story to the second. Yet, beneath their differences, the swords and skyscrapers, the kingdoms and city blocks, they speak the same language, the struggle to carry a burden too heavy for one soul, and the quiet grace of those who choose to carry it anyway. Frodo Baggins and Bruce Wayne begin from the same rude, ordinary lives, shattered by something extraordinary. Neither seeks power, both inherited as responsibility. The One Ring and the Bat are the same in essence, symbols that transform those who bear them. Both offer purpose, but at a price. The ring isolates Frodo, eating away at his joy. The cowl isolates Bruce, stripping him of peace. And in both tales, the true battle is not against evil itself, but against the corruption that comes from holding it too long. Frodo's journey is literal, a walk through wastelands that mirror his own exhaustion. Bruce's is psychological, but no less perilous. Gotham is his Mordor, a landscape scarred by greed and shadows. Its streets whisper temptation, vengeance, control, permanence. Like the ring, Gotham's darkness calls softly, promising justice through domination. And like Frodo, Bruce must learn that true victory is not to master the darkness, but to let it go before it consumes him. There is a moment in Tolkien's world, near the end, when Frodo can go no farther. His strength collapses under the weight of his burden, and it is then that Samwise Gamgee, steadfast and pure, says, "I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you." That line, in its simplicity, might as well have been written for Alfred Pennyworth. For all the grandeur of Gotham and the myth of the Bat, it was Alfred who carried Bruce through his weariness, the one who made tea for the man who could not rest, who stitched wounds on nights that had no morning. Alfred is Samwise, without armor, the quiet strength that ensures legends survive long enough to finish their work. The Bat family, too, is its own fellowship. Each member carries a fragment of Bruce's divided soul. Dick Grayson is his laughter and light. Jason Todd, his rage and rebellion. Tim Drake, his intellect and curiosity. Barbara Gordon, his conscience. Damian Wayne, his legacy and pride. Like Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, they are distinct and flawed, but bound by shared purpose. They remind him that heroism, like fellowship, is not about perfection, but persistence. No one saves the world alone, not even the Dark Knight. The parallels between Middle-earth and Gotham run deeper than they first appear. Both are worlds built on decay and resistance. Sauron and Gotham's corruption are not monsters to be slain once, but conditions of existence, permanent, cyclical, and unending. Evil in both universes is systemic, not supernatural. It thrives in the cracks of power, waiting for the complacent to look away. And in both stories, hope survives, not through conquest, but through endurance. The difference lies in how they end. Tolkien's myth closes with healing. The ring destroyed, the Shire restored, the heroes given their rest. Batman's story never finds that closure. His ring cannot be unmade, his city cannot be purified. The best he can do is hold the line until someone else takes his place. Frodo sails into the west to find peace. Bruce walks into the dawn, knowing peace will never find him, and accepts it anyway. It is the difference between salvation and stewardship. There is a sadness in that realization, but also a strange beauty. Frodo's departure tells us that some wounds can only be healed by leaving. Bruce's endurance tells us that some wounds become the reason we stay. They are both forms of grace. One lets go, the other holds on, and yet, even in Bruce's endless night, there is fellowship. His allies, like Frodo's, evolve from followers into equals. They question him, challenge him, surpass him. In time, Gotham becomes less dependent on its guardian and more reflective of his example. That is his version of the Shire's restoration, not a paradise, but a persistence of hope. His fellowship continues, even when he does not. In both myths, there is an understanding that heroism demands sacrifice of self. The hero is rarely rewarded. They are changed, diminished, set apart. Frodo cannot return to the world he saved. Bruce cannot join the world he protects. Both are haunted by what they've endured, yet they share the same reward, the quiet knowledge that their suffering bought others the chance to live freely. It is not happiness, but it is peace enough. What ties Gotham's rooftops to the hills of Middle-earth is the same truth that ties all great myths together. Evil does not vanish, it transforms. Every victory is temporary, every peace conditional. The world always rebuilds its monsters. What matters is not that we defeat them, but that we continue to resist them, even when the light fades. Tolkien wrote that the smallest person can change the course of the future. Batman's story adds a darker but equally hopeful echo that even the most broken person can hold back the darkness for one more night. Both teach endurance, both honor faith. Frodo carried the ring until he could carry it no longer. Bruce carried his vow until others could bear it with him. And somewhere, in the silence after the battle, both find a kind of rest, not in the end of struggle, but in the knowledge that it meant something. Frodo sails west into legend. Bruce fades into myth beneath the rising sun. Different worlds, same truth. The fellowship endures, even when the hero is gone, because the truest stories never end in victory. They end in continuity, one life passing the flame to another, one legend reminding the next that courage is not a destination, but a rhythm that must be kept alive. And in that rhythm, whether in Mordor or Gotham, the light always returns. And that is where our journey through the shadow and the city comes to rest. We walked the alleys of Gotham together, from the vow made in blood to the legacy carried in silence. We saw how a boy's grief became a symbol, how fear turned into discipline, and how, even in endless darkness, hope found its way back. Maybe that's what Batman really teaches us, that we don't have to be unbreakable, just unyielding. That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do while you're still afraid. If you made it here, through every echo and every heartbeat of Gotham, take a moment before you drift off. What part of his story spoke to you most? The vow, the city, the legacy? Tell me in the comments below. I read every one like letters left under the bat signal. And if this story helped you slow down tonight, or made you think a little deeper about what heroism really means, hit that like button, not for me, but as your quiet signal that the night stories should continue. Because this channel isn't just about Gotham, it's about all the worlds that shape us. Next time, we'll journey to galaxies far, far away to explore the balance of the Force in Star Wars lore. There's so much more to uncover, from ancient myths to modern heroes, and you're invited to explore them all right here. So if you haven't already, subscribe and keep the notifications on. Not so you don't miss an upload, but so you never lose your place in the story. Now, let the sound of the rain carry you. Rest easy. And remember, the night is never endless, as long as someone still believes in the dawn. Good night from Gotham.